The morning they said would end me, I wore flat shoes. Not because I was nervous, because I knew I wouldn't need the height. Marcus sat across a mahogany table on the 14th floor of a building he'd never paid a bill inside, his lawyer on his left, yellow legal pad on his right, and that half smile he'd been wearing since 2019 stretched across his face like he'd already won something. He looked at me the way men look at things they've already thrown away. Comfortable, almost bored. "You're going to walk away with nothing, baby," he said. He said it quietly like a favor. I reached into the folder in front of me, took out 11 pages held together by a single binder clip, and slid them across the table. He went quiet so fast the air conditioning sounded loud. "Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's in this room with me." The first time Marcus Webb made me laugh. We were standing in the parking lot of a Kroger on Cascade Road at 11:30 at night, arguing about whether rotisserie chicken counted as cooking. It was October 2011. I was 23 years old, carrying 2 canvas bags, and a receipt I'd been staring at for 10 minutes because I'd miscalculated my checking account balance by $47. And I was trying to decide which items to put back. He was parked next to my car, eating sunflower seeds out of a paper bag, and he said completely unprompted, "You look like somebody who's real good at math and real bad at grocery budgets." I should have kept walking. Instead, I laughed. And then I told him he was right on both counts. Marcus was 32 then. He ran a small construction subcontracting business out of a rented office space in East Point. 3 employees, 1 truck, a logo his cousin had designed for $200. He wasn't rich. He wasn't even close. But he had a way of talking about the future, like he could already see it, like it was just a matter of time before the rest of the world caught up to what he already knew about himself. I found that magnetic. I was young enough that I hadn't yet learned to ask what someone's confidence was actually built on. I was a junior accountant at a mid-size financial firm in Buckhead. I'd graduated from Spelman 2 years earlier with $34,000 in student loan debt, and a GPA that had earned me a scholarship for my last semester, but not the ones before it. I shared an apartment with 2 roommates in College Park. I packed my lunch every day. I tracked every dollar in a spreadsheet I updated every Sunday night without fail. We dated for 8 months before he met my parents. My mother, Doris, shook his hand and then found me in the kitchen afterward and said quietly and without drama, "He's charming, baby. Just make sure he's also consistent." I smiled and told her he was. I believed it when I said it. Marcus was consistent in the beginning. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered small things. He called when he landed after work trips, even short ones. He came to my work events and stood next to me without making me feel like I had to manage him. Those things matter when you're 23 and you've watched your friends date men who disappear for days without explanation. Reliability felt like love. I didn't know yet that reliability can be a strategy just as much as anything else. We got engaged in 2014. He proposed at Pascal's, the original location, the one with the history, the one my grandmother used to talk about. He'd called ahead, spoken to the manager, arranged for her favorite song to play. It was thoughtful, in a way that felt personal, not performed. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The prenuptial agreement was my idea. I want to be clear about that because later, much later, Marcus would tell people it was something his lawyer pushed, something he'd been reluctant about. That was a lie. I brought it up. I was the one who sat across from him at the kitchen table in our first apartment and said plainly that I thought it was smart. I'd been promoted twice by then. I was managing accounts worth more than anything either of us had grown up around. I'd watched colleagues go through divorces that turned into audits. I understood what unprotected assets looked like in a courtroom. Marcus agreed without much resistance. He seemed almost relieved, actually. Said it made sense. said it showed we were both being adults about it. We each hired separate attorneys. The process took 3 months. We signed in April 2015, 2 months before the wedding. What Marcus didn't know, what he had no reason to think about, because he hadn't been paying attention to the right things, was that I read every line of that document myself before my lawyer read it. And then I read it again. And I asked questions that my attorney initially seemed surprised by, questions about specific clauses, about enforceability, about what happened in the event of documented infidelity. Georgia is not a no-fault-only state when it comes to financial settlements. There are provisions if you know where to look, if you plan ahead. I wasn't planning for divorce when I asked those questions. I want to be honest about that too. I was planning the way I always planned, thoroughly, without assuming the best outcome. Because assuming the best outcome is how people end up with $47 less than they thought they had standing in a grocery store parking lot. We got married on a Saturday in June. My dress had pockets. My mother cried. Marcus danced with his grandmother to an Anita Baker song, and I stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching him genuinely happy. That part was real. I need you to know that. Not everything that came before the ending was a lie. Some of it was just a marriage. It's the good parts that make the bad parts so hard to file away cleanly. In the first 3 years, we built things. His business grew. He landed 2 commercial contracts in 2017 that changed his cash flow entirely, and I helped him restructure his bookkeeping, connected him with a CPA I trusted, co-signed on a line of credit that let him hire 6 more people. I didn't do those things as transactions. I did them because that's what you do when you believe in someone. You use what you're good at to help them go further than they could alone. What I didn't realize was that I was also teaching him what I was worth, and that some men, once they know your value, start calculating how to hold on to it without paying for it. The first year I cleared 6 figures on my own. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage of our building at 7:15 in the morning, looking at my direct deposit notification, and feeling something so close to peace, I almost didn't recognize it. I transferred a portion to an investment account I'd opened in my name alone, not to hide it, but because I'd always kept my own accounts separate, even in marriage. Because my mother's mother had told me once that a woman should always have a door she can walk through on her own. I thought of that transfer 2 years later, sitting in a parking lot again, in a very different car, looking at a very different screen. But that comes later. What matters right now is this. By the time Marcus started coming home at 9 when he used to come home at 6, I'd already been quietly, carefully building something he knew nothing about. Not out of suspicion, out of habit, out of the discipline of a woman who learned early that the only money you can count on is the money you managed yourself. He had no idea. And that single fact was the door I would eventually walk through. The first sign was a smell. Not perfume exactly. Something lighter than that, a body lotion maybe, or a hair product, the kind that comes in a small jar and costs more than it should. Warm vanilla and something underneath it I couldn't name. I noticed it on a Tuesday in March 2 years ago when Marcus came home at 9:47 and leaned down to kiss my cheek in the kitchen while I was washing a single dish I'd left in the sink. The smell came with him and stayed after he walked toward the bedroom. I stood at the sink with the water still running, and I thought, that's not mine. I didn't say anything. I finished the dish, I dried my hands, I went to bed. I've thought about that moment many times since then, the moment I knew something before I was ready to know it. And what I keep coming back to is how quiet I was. Not because I was weak, because I was trained by years of working in rooms where the person who reacts first loses to hold information until I knew what to do with it. I filed the smell away the same way I filed discrepancies in balance sheets. A note. A flag. Not a conclusion yet. Just a data point. The data points accumulated slowly, then all at once. His phone started living face down. Not always, that would have been too obvious, and Marcus was not a careless man, just often enough. Just in the specific moments when a notification might come through and he didn't want to manage my eyes moving toward the screen. I noticed the pattern before I noticed the behavior, which is the accountant in me. I see the trend line before I see the individual numbers. He started going to the gym in the evenings instead of the mornings. We had been morning gym people for 6 years. He said his schedule changed. I said okay. I noted it. He bought a car in November without telling me. Until after the financing was done, a black Cadillac Escalade, fully loaded, the kind of purchase we would have discussed for weeks in our previous life. He showed me photos on his phone, pleased with himself, and said he'd gotten a good deal. I looked at the photos and asked what the monthly payment was, and he said he'd handle it. He'd never used that phrase before. Handle it. Like the finances of our household were now divided into sections. And that section was his alone. I said, okay, Marcus. I noted it. There was a dinner at my colleague Renee's house in December, her annual holiday gathering 12 people, good food, the kind of evening where everyone stays too late because no one wants to be the first to leave. Marcus was quiet in a way he wasn't usually quiet at social events. He was usually the person other people gathered toward, the one with the story that made the room louder. That night, he checked his phone 4 times in 90 minutes. I counted, because counting is what I do when something feels wrong and I'm not ready to name it. On the drive home, he said the food was good, and I agreed, and we didn't say much else. In January, his gym bag started coming home cleaner than it should have, for something that had actually been to a gym. I didn't confront him. I want to be clear about that, not because I was afraid, and not because I was in denial, but because I had learned something in my professional life that applied with devastating precision to my personal one. You do not move on a discrepancy until you have documentation. Accusations without evidence are just noise. Noise gives the other person time to adjust, to delete, to reframe. I wasn't going to give Marcus time to adjust, so I watched. And I filed. And I kept our life looking exactly the same from the outside dinner on the table. Some nights plans made for the weekends, conversations about nothing that felt like conversations about everything used to feel. The performance of normalcy is exhausting in a way I can't fully describe. Not because it requires you to pretend you feel things you don't, but because it requires you to keep feeling the real things. The grief, the slow burning anger, the particular loneliness of lying next to someone who has already left, and then fold them up small enough to carry without anyone seeing the shape of them through your clothes. I got very good at folding. February came. We celebrated our 8th anniversary at a restaurant in Virginia Highland because it was the kind of place we used to go when we were first married, and money was tighter, and dinner out meant something. He ordered the same thing he always ordered. He held my hand across the table for a moment before the food came. I let him. I looked at his face and tried to find the man from the Kroger parking lot in 2011. And he was there, a little still around the eyes, in the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, and I felt something I did not expect to feel. I felt sorry for him, not because of what he was doing to me. I had already begun to understand that what he was doing to me was not going to destroy me. I felt sorry for him because of what he didn't know, because he was sitting across from me on our anniversary, holding my hand, calculating what he thought I was worth, and he was wrong by a margin that would eventually take his breath away. He just didn't know it yet. The knowing came for me 6 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon in late March, in the parking garage beneath the Whole Foods on Ponce de Leon Avenue. Marcus had left his iPad in the back seat of the Escalade. He'd been driving my car that day because his was in for a detail. And when I went to move the Escalade to the other parking structure, I found it wedged between the seat and the door, half covered by his gym jacket, the screen still warm. I sat in that car for a long time before I touched it. Not because I was afraid of what I'd find. I already knew what I'd find. I sat there because I understood that once I looked, the last version of my marriage, the one that existed only in the space between suspicion and confirmation, would be gone. And grief is strange that way. You can mourn something you already know is dead before you have the proof of it. You can need a moment with the ghost before you call it by its name. I picked up the iPad. I opened the Photos app. I started counting. 247 photographs. I counted them twice. The second time slower than the first, not because I doubted the number, but because counting gave my hands something to do while the rest of me went somewhere else entirely. The parking garage was dim and smelled like exhaust and concrete. And somewhere above me, a car alarm went off. And then stopped, and I sat in the front seat of my husband's Escalade and looked at 247 photographs of a life he had been living without me. Her name I didn't know yet. I would learn it later. Amber, 29, a marketing coordinator at a hospitality firm in Buckhead, long box braids with honey blonde tips, the kind of smile that looked effortless in photographs because she'd had years of practice making it look that way. In the photos, she looked happy. So did he. That was the part I hadn't prepared myself for, not the existence of her, but the happiness, the ease of them. The way he stood next to her in restaurants and hotel lobbies, and once in what looked like Piedmont Park on a Sunday afternoon, with the light coming through the trees like something from a movie, and he looked relaxed, in a way I had not seen him look in our home in at least 2 years. There were photos dated as far back as 14 months. 14 months. I set the iPad face down on the passenger seat. I looked through the windshield at the gray concrete wall in front of me. A yellow painted number 47 was stenciled on the pillar to my left. I stared at it for a while. I thought about the fact that I had paid off the last of Marcus's business line of credit 11 months ago, which meant for 3 months he had been taking this woman to restaurants while I was writing checks to cover his operational debt. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, not to make myself sound harder than I am. But because the absence of tears confused me at the time, and I later came to understand it. I didn't cry because the grief I was feeling wasn't the sharp, sudden kind that produces tears. It was the slow, deep kind that produces clarity, like a room coming into focus, like a spreadsheet where the numbers have finally added up to the figure you suspected all along, but had been hoping was wrong. Everything made sense now. The phone face down on the counter, the gym bag that came home clean, the anniversary dinner where he held my hand and looked at me with an expression I'd read as tenderness and now recalibrated as guilt, trying to look like love. The Escalade purchase, I understood that too now. He'd bought it for her as much as for himself. A vehicle she could ride in without it being traceable back to our household accounts. I sat in that car for 41 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard move from 2:17 to 2:58, and I didn't touch anything. I just thought. I am a person who thinks best when I'm very still. And I had not been this still in months. Here is what I decided in those 41 minutes. I was not going to confront him. Not yet. Not until I had turned this moment, this raw, unprocessed parking garage moment, into something that could not be argued with, deleted, or spun. I had seen too many women burn their documentation in the fire of a confrontation, say everything they knew in one scorched conversation, and give the other person time to regroup. I was not going to do that. I was going to be patient. I was going to be methodical. And I was going to read every single line of our prenuptial agreement before the week was out. I picked the iPad back up. I took my own phone out of my bag. I photographed every photograph on that screen that showed her face. His face, a timestamp, a location tag, a text preview visible at the top of the screen. It took 23 minutes. My hands were steady the entire time. I have thought about that steadiness since what it means that my hands didn't shake. And I think it means that some part of me had been preparing for this moment for longer than I consciously knew. When I was done, I put the iPad back exactly where I found it. Wedged between the seat and the door, half covered by the gym jacket screen down same angle. I took a breath. I moved the Escalade to the other parking structure. I went into the Whole Foods and bought the things on my list. Greek yogurt, limes, a rotisserie chicken coffee, and I paid with my card, and I said thank you to the cashier. And I loaded the bags into the trunk, and I drove home. Marcus was on the phone in the kitchen when I got there. He held up one finger when he saw me, the universal gesture, for 1 second, and kept talking. A business call from the sound of it. I unpacked the groceries. I put the yogurt in the refrigerator. I found a container for the chicken. I stood at the counter and listened to him talk about load-bearing columns and permit timelines, and I thought he has absolutely no idea. That thought, that single, quiet, devastating thought, was the first thing that felt like power. He hung up and came to where I was standing and kissed my temple and asked what I'd gotten at the store. I told him. He said good, he'd been craving chicken. He opened the refrigerator, found the container, and took it to the couch to eat in front of the television like it was an ordinary Thursday. Because for him, it was. His ordinary Thursday had continued uninterrupted. Mine had split into a before and an after so clean I could feel the edge of it. I went to the bedroom and closed the door quietly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed. I opened my phone and found the folder I had just created labeled with a string of numbers that meant nothing to anyone but me, and I looked at the first photograph again. Then I put the phone in my nightstand drawer under a book I'd been pretending to read for 6 weeks. I went back to the kitchen. I sat next to my husband. I watched television, and I started planning. I called Patricia Okafor on a Monday morning from the parking garage of my office building. Not from my desk, not from home. From the 3rd level of a concrete structure on West Peachtree Street, where I had driven in circles for 4 minutes to find a spot far enough from the elevator that no one would walk past my car while I was on the phone. I had Patricia's number from a colleague who had gone through a divorce 2 years prior and described her as the kind of lawyer who reads the document and then reads it again and finds the thing everyone else missed. That description was the only credential I needed. Patricia picked up on the second ring. I told her I needed a consultation. I told her it was not urgent in the way emergencies are urgent, but that I needed to move carefully, and I needed someone who understood the difference between moving fast and moving well. She said she had an opening Thursday at 4. I said I'd be there. I did not tell Marcus I was going. I told him I had a client dinner. I had given him so little reason to question my schedule over the years. I was, if anything, the more predictable one. The one whose whereabouts were never mysterious, that the lie landed without friction. He said okay and asked if he should order food for himself. I said yes. I left the house at 3:15 in a blazer I'd hung on the back of my office chair that morning, specifically so I would look like someone going to a dinner. And I drove to Patricia Okafor's office on Piedmont Road. And I sat across from her at a desk covered in color-coded folders. And I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. That was the first thing I noticed about her, the quality of her attention. She took notes in a small black notebook with a pen she kept clicking open and closed, not nervously but rhythmically like a metronome keeping time under the conversation. When I finished, she looked at her notes for a moment, and then looked at me and said, "Do you have a copy of the prenuptial agreement?" I said I had the original. She said she'd like to see it before we went any further. I had brought it. Of course I had brought it. I had retrieved it from the fireproof lockbox under our bed, the one Marcus knew existed, but had never shown particular interest in on Sunday night while he was watching a game in the living room, and I had made 2 copies at the FedEx on Campbellton Road on my lunch break, and placed 1 copy in a padded envelope I mailed to my mother's address in Decatur, and kept the other in my work bag in a folder marked Q2 Projections that I had carried to this appointment. I gave Patricia the copy. She read it the way I imagined she read everything thoroughly, without expression, occasionally returning to a previous page. It took her 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on her wall, a plain analog clock with a white face, the kind that makes no sound at all, which I appreciated. When she finished, she set it down and clicked her pen open. "There's an infidelity clause," she said. "I know," I said. "It's enforceable in Georgia under the circumstances you've described, assuming your documentation meets the threshold." "I have 247 photographs," I said. "Time-stamped, several with location data." She looked at me for a moment over the rim of her glasses. "How long have you had them?" 11 days. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are recalibrating their understanding of who they're dealing with. "And he doesn't know you have them?" "No." "Good," she said. "Keep it that way." We spent the next hour going through the prenuptial agreement section by section. I had read it myself the night before, not for the first time, but for the first time with the specific intention of finding every clause that applied to where I now stood, and I had made notes in pencil in the margins of my personal copy questions and observations I'd flagged for her. Patricia answered each one without condescension, which I mention because I have sat in enough professional meetings to know that being taken seriously is not something every room offers without being asked for. The infidelity clause was clear. If either party could demonstrate documented evidence of extramarital involvement during the marriage, the affected party was entitled to a structured financial settlement beyond the standard asset division. The number attached to that clause, calculated against our current combined marital assets, was $380,000 payable from Marcus's share. More significantly, the prenuptial agreement I had drafted in 2015 contained language that protected all assets I had accumulated independently, including investment accounts held solely in my name. Marcus's attorney had reviewed the document. Marcus had signed it. He had simply not paid close enough attention to what specifically was being protected. I had been making regular transfers to a Fidelity investment account in my name since 2016. The account was not hidden. It appeared on our joint tax returns as required, labeled under my Social Security number in a line item that Marcus's eyes had passed over every April without stopping. By March of this year, the account held $1.4 million. He thought we had money together. He did not know how much I had alone. I left Patricia's office at 6:12 and sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine. The evening was still light, that particular Atlanta March light that can't decide if it's winter or spring. And I watched people walk in and out of the building across the street, ordinary people at the end of an ordinary day. And I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Steady, not happy, not relieved, not angry, steady. The way a structure feels when you've checked its load-bearing points and confirmed that nothing critical has been compromised. I had walked into that office carrying the weight of something I didn't yet know how to hold. I left it understanding that the weight had always been mine to carry, and that I had, without knowing, been building the infrastructure to carry it for years. I called my mother on the drive home. I didn't tell her about Marcus. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, not because I was protecting him, but because saying it out loud to someone who loved me would make it real in a different way, a softer and more devastating way. And I needed to stay in the practical register for a little while longer. I called her because I wanted to hear her voice and know she was home, and that the copy of my prenuptial agreement was somewhere safe. She picked up on the first ring the way she always did. "Naomi, baby," she said. "How are you?" "I'm okay, Mama," I said. And for the first time in weeks, that was almost true. I went home. Marcus was watching television again, a half-eaten container of pad thai on the coffee table beside him. He looked up when I came in and said the client dinner ran long, and I said yes a little. He asked if I was tired, And I said yes. He turned back to the television. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I opened the drawer next to the stove, where I kept miscellaneous things. Rubber bands, takeout menus, a small flashlight, spare keys. And I found the blue ink pen I'd been looking for 2 weeks. I held it for a moment. Then I went to the second bedroom we used as an office, sat at my desk, and opened a new notebook I had bought that afternoon at the CVS on Peachtree Battle Avenue. Black cover college ruled 100 pages. I uncapped the blue pen. I wrote the date at the top of the first page. And I began. Marcus filed first. I had expected him to. Men like Marcus, men who have decided something is over and spent months rehearsing the ending in their heads, rarely wait once they've made up their mind. Waiting requires sitting with the weight of what you're doing, and that requires a kind of self-awareness he had never been particularly burdened with. He served me on a Wednesday afternoon in April through his attorney's process server, a young man in a blue polo shirt, who knocked on our front door at 2:15 while I was working from home and handed me a manila envelope with the careful neutrality of someone who had done this many times before. I signed for it. I thanked him. I closed the door. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea before I opened it. Not because I was stalling. I'd been expecting this for 6 weeks, but because I had learned in the months since the parking garage that small, deliberate acts of normalcy were how I kept myself in the register I needed to stay in. The kettle, the mug, the 2 minutes of waiting. By the time I sat down at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me, I was level. I read the filing carefully. His attorney, a partner at a firm in Sandy Springs named Gerald Holt, whose name I recognized from a professional association newsletter I'd received the previous year, had structured the petition to minimize Marcus's exposure while maximizing the ambiguity around asset division. It was competent work. It characterized our marriage as an equal partnership in which both parties had contributed proportionally, which was technically true if you ignored the line of credit. I'd co-signed the bookkeeping restructuring I'd provided for free for 3 years, and the $380 000 infidelity clause his client had quietly earned. Patricia had told me to expect exactly this. She had also told me not to respond emotionally, not to call Marcus, and not to change anything about my daily behavior. I did none of those things. What I did do that evening was call my father. This requires some explanation. My father, Winston, is a retired civil engineer who spent 31 years at a municipal infrastructure firm and approaches every situation in his life, including emotional ones, as though it is a load distribution problem with a correct solution available to anyone willing to sit down and calculate it. He and my mother have been married for 41 years. He is not a warm man in the conventional sense, but he is a deeply reliable one. And in the taxonomy of men I have known in my life, reliability has come to mean more to me than warmth. I called him because I trusted him completely, and because I needed to tell someone who would not cry. I told him about Marcus, about the photographs, about the prenuptial agreement and Patricia Okafor, and the $1.4 million he hadn't known existed. I told him calmly, in the same register I would use to walk a client through a quarterly report, because that was the only way I knew how to say it, without falling apart. My father was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Did you make copies of everything?" "Yes," I said. "And they're somewhere safe?" "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Good girl," he said, which is what he has said to me since I was 7 years old, whenever I have done something he considers correct, and which still at 38 makes something in my chest settle. He did not ask about my feelings. I did not offer them. We talked for another 12 minutes about the legal process, about timelines, about what to expect from Gerald Holt's strategy. When we hung up, I felt the particular comfort of having been seen by someone who knew me well enough not to treat me like I was fragile. What happened 4 days later was the thing that tested that composure more than anything that had come before. Marcus called my father directly. Not to confess, not to apologize, to get ahead of the story. He called Winston. Webb called him on a Sunday morning at 9:45, while my father was eating breakfast and my mother was in the garden, and told him that the marriage had broken down due to irreconcilable differences, that he had tried to work things out privately, and that he hoped the family could remain respectful and adult through the process. He did not mention Amber. He did not mention the 14 months of photographs. He framed it as a mutual dissolution of a marriage that had simply run its course, and he delivered this framing to my father before I had the chance to shape any narrative at all. My father listened. He thanked Marcus for calling. He said goodbye. Then he called me. He called me, my father said. I know, I said. I figured he would. He's managing perception, my father said. Not a question. Yes. A pause. He called me before you did. I know, Dad, I'm sorry. Don't apologize, he said. Just make sure your lawyer is ready. I said she was. I did not tell him that what Marcus had just done, calling my father to preemptively frame the narrative to plant the seed of mutual and amicable, before I could plant anything else, had confirmed something I'd been suspecting for weeks. Marcus wasn't just filing for divorce. He was running a campaign. He was managing every stakeholder he could reach my family, his business partners, likely our mutual friends, to build a version of this story in which Naomi walked away quietly and gratefully with whatever he decided to offer her. He thought I would be too proud to fight and too tired to plan. He had been watching the wrong version of me. The version of me he knew, the one who packed her lunch every day, who co-signed his line of credit without being asked, who lay next to him in the dark for months, folding her grief into shapes small enough to carry, that woman had never shown him what she looked like when she'd made up her mind. He was about to find out. Gerald Holt's office contacted Patricia 3 days later with their opening position on asset division. It was precisely what I had expected. A clean split of jointly held assets, a modest spousal support figure that assumed I would need it, and no mention of the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause, which told me that either Gerald Holt had not read the document carefully enough, or Marcus had not told his attorney the full truth about his conduct during the marriage. Either way, it was the position of a man who believed he held all the cards. Patricia responded within 48 hours. Her response did not mention the infidelity clause either. It simply requested a full accounting of all assets jointly and separately held, along with supporting documentation going back to the date of the marriage. Standard discovery language, unremarkable on its face. It was also the first move in a sequence Marcus could not see yet. A sequence that would end in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, on a morning when he would say something he would spend a very long time wishing he could take back. 12 days before that morning, Marcus's mother called me. Her name is Cheryl. She is 64 years old and has always been kind to me in a way that felt genuine, rather than obligatory, the kind of mother-in-law who remembers your coffee order and asks about your coworkers by name. She called on a Thursday evening, and her voice was careful in a way it had never been before. "Naomi," she said. "I heard." "I know," I said. A long pause. "Are you okay?" I thought about how to answer that. "I'm working on it," I said, which was true in a way she wasn't equipped to fully understand. "I want you to know," she said, "that whatever Marcus has told people, whatever he's saying about how this happened, I know my son. And I know that whatever happened, you didn't deserve it." I held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the street below, where a woman was walking a dog in the last of the evening light, moving slowly in no hurry to be anywhere. "Thank you, Cheryl," I said. She started to say something else, and then stopped. Then, he doesn't know what he's losing. I thought about a parking garage in March. About 247 photographs. About a blue pen and a black notebook and a fidelity account that had been growing quietly for 8 years while Marcus was busy looking elsewhere. "No," I said. "He really doesn't." Patricia filed our response on a Tuesday morning at 9:03. I know the exact time because she texted me when it was done, a single line. No punctuation, the way she communicated when she was in motion. Filed. Now we wait. I was at my desk in Buckhead in the middle of a budget variance review for a client whose numbers had been giving me trouble since February. And I read the text and set my phone face down on the desk and went back to the spreadsheet. There was nothing to do but work. The document was in the system now. It existed in the world independently of me, moving through channels I couldn't control or accelerate. 3 things happened in the 4 days that followed. The first was that Gerald Holt's office received our full discovery request, and according to Patricia, went quiet in a way that suggested they were recalibrating. When opposing counsel goes quiet after a discovery request, it usually means one of 2 things. Either they have nothing to hide and are simply being thorough, or they have something to hide and are deciding how much of it they can reasonably obscure. The silence lasted 72 hours, which was longer than it should have taken for a preliminary acknowledgement. The second thing was that Marcus called me. Not his attorney. Marcus himself at 7:41 on a Wednesday evening, while I was eating dinner alone at the kitchen table of the house we still technically shared, but had been living in like 2 people occupying separate floors of the same building. A choreography of avoidance so practiced by then that we had developed an unconscious system for never occupying the same room at the same time without a reason. I let it ring. He called again at 7:44. I let that ring too. At 7:46, he sent a text that said, "Can we talk? Not through lawyers, just us." I read it. I set my phone down. I finished my dinner. Then I typed back, "Please direct all communication through Patricia Okafor's office." I included her phone number, which he already had, and sent it before I could think too much about the particular coldness of reducing a 12-year relationship to a contact referral. He didn't respond. He called back once more at 8:15, let it ring twice, and stopped. I did not hear from him directly again. The third thing was the document that arrived at Gerald Holt's office on Friday afternoon. Patricia had structured our discovery response to arrive at the end of the business week, deliberately Friday afternoon, when opposing counsel is winding down. When the instinct is to set things aside until Monday, when the window between receiving information and being able to act on it is longest. Inside the response was a full accounting of my independently held assets, as required by Georgia disclosure law, accompanied by 8 years of supporting documentation, account statements, transfer records, tax filings, the relevant sections of our prenuptial agreement highlighted in yellow, and a single-page summary prepared by Patricia's paralegal that translated the legal language into arithmetic. The arithmetic was clear. My Fidelity investment account, $1,412,847, as of the most recent statement protected under Section 4B of our prenuptial agreement as an asset accumulated independently and held solely in my name. A secondary savings account I had opened in 2019, $94,300. A life insurance policy with a cash value component I had been building since 2013, $67,000. Total independently protected assets, $1,574,147, none of which Marcus was entitled to under the terms of the document he had signed in April 2015 and apparently never revisited. Also included in the discovery response in a separate tabbed section, Patricia had labeled simply Exhibit C, was a selection of the documentation I had compiled over the preceding 6 weeks, not the photographs themselves, not yet, but records that established the pattern hotel charges on a credit card in Marcus's name that had appeared on our joint tax return as business expenses restaurant transactions in locations inconsistent with the business travel he had reported to me, and a signed declaration from a private investigator Patricia had retained 3 weeks prior. who had conducted independent surveillance and produced a 12-page report with supporting materials. The infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement required documented evidence meeting a reasonable evidentiary standard. We had met it with room to spare. Gerald Holt called Patricia at 9:17 on Monday morning. Patricia told me about the call that afternoon, seated across from me at her desk. Her notebook open, her pen, still for once. She said Holt had been professional, but that there had been something in his voice she recognized from other cases, the particular register of an attorney who has just discovered that his client had withheld material information. He asked for time, Patricia said. How much time? He said 2 weeks. I told him 1. I nodded. And Marcus called Holt 11 times between 9:17 and 10 o'clock Monday morning, she said. Holt's assistant told my paralegal. Apparently the calls started coming in before Holt had even hung up with me. I thought about that image Marcus in whatever room he was in at 9:17 on a Monday, receiving the information, understanding for the first time what he was actually looking at. I thought about the spreadsheet of his assumptions, all the calculations he had run in his head about what Naomi had, what Naomi could prove, what Naomi would settle for. And I thought about what it must have felt like to watch those numbers change all at once. 11 calls in 43 minutes. I had received 11 calls from Marcus in my entire life before this year. He was not a phone person. He had once told me early in our relationship that he only called people when something was wrong. Something was wrong. He tried to reach me twice more that week through channels that were not his attorney. Once through a mutual friend named Darnell, who called me on a Tuesday evening with the careful discomfort of someone who knew he was being used as a messenger and didn't want to be, but couldn't figure out how to refuse. Darnell said Marcus wanted me to know he was open to a conversation. I told Darnell I appreciated him calling, and that Marcus had my attorney's contact information. Darnell said he understood, and then said almost as an afterthought, "He seemed scared, Naomi." I said I understood. I thanked him again and let him go. The second attempt came through Marcus's mother. Cheryl called me on Wednesday morning, and this time her voice was different, tighter, the carefulness gone, replaced by something that sounded like genuine distress. She said Marcus had told her some of what was in the documents. She said she didn't know the details, but that she could hear in his voice that it was serious. She wasn't calling to advocate for him, she said. She just wanted me to know that whatever happened in the legal process, she hoped I would be okay. I believed her. Cheryl had always been a woman who meant what she said. I told her I was going to be fine. "I know you are," she said. And then quietly, he told me about the account, the investment account. A pause. He didn't know. "No," I said. He didn't. "How long?" 8 years, I said. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, "Naomi, baby." Another pause. "You were always the one holding things together, weren't you?" It wasn't a question. I didn't answer it like one. "Take care of yourself, Cheryl," I said. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table and looked at my hands for a moment, the same hands that had been steady in a parking garage in March, that had photographed 247 images, without shaking, that had uncapped a blue pen and opened a black notebook and written a date at the top of a clean page. In 7 days, I would walk into a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street. Marcus would be waiting. He would be wearing the watch that was too expensive for the room. He would have his yellow legal pad. He would have Gerald Holt beside him, and the half-smile that he had been wearing since 2019, and the absolute certainty of a man who had decided, based on everything he thought he knew about me, that this was going to go his way. He had 1 more week to believe that. I was going to let him have it. The conference room on the 14th floor smelled like fresh coffee and old carpet. and the particular kind of recirculated air that comes from a building that has been sealed against the outside world for decades. I arrived 8 minutes early, not because I was nervous. I'd not been nervous in the way I expected to be nervous, which was something I had thought about in the days leading up to this morning, the absence of the feeling I had anticipated. What I felt instead was a kind of focused quiet. The same state I entered before a difficult client presentation or a complex audit when everything peripheral fell away and only the work remained. I wore a charcoal wool blazer over a black silk blouse and flat shoes. The same flat shoes I had worn the morning they served me the divorce papers, because I had decided in some deliberate and private way that flat shoes were what I wore when I did not need to perform height. Patricia was already in the room when I arrived. She was standing at the window, looking out at Peachtree Street, 14 floors below, a cup of coffee in one hand and her black notebook in the other. She turned when I came in and looked at me the way she had looked at me in our first meeting, assessing precise recalibrating something. "How are you?" she said. "Ready," I said. She nodded once, which was all the acknowledgement the moment needed. Marcus arrived 6 minutes later with Gerald Holt and a younger associate. I didn't recognize a woman in her late 20s with a laptop bag over one shoulder who took a seat at the far end of the table and opened a notebook without making eye contact with anyone. Gerald Holt was a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and the measured movements of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one. He shook Patricia's hand with professional courtesy and acknowledged me with a nod that was neither warm nor cold. Marcus walked in last. He was wearing the watch, the one with the broad face and the gold bezel that he had bought the previous year and worn to every significant occasion since the way some men carry their confidence on their wrist because they need it to be visible. He had on a dark suit I recognized, charcoal, well cut, the one he wore when he wanted to make an impression, and his fade was fresh, his shoulders set the way they always were when he walked into a room he believed he owned. He looked at me once when he sat down. Not long. A glance the kind calibrated to communicate something without committing to it, not hostility, not softness, something in the middle that I read as assessment. He was checking to see what version of me had shown up. I looked back at him steadily and said nothing. Gerald Holt opened by summarizing the purpose of the meeting, a mediated settlement conference exploratory in nature aimed at reaching an agreement that would preclude the need for litigation. He used the word amicable twice in the first 3 minutes. Patricia let him finish before she said anything. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Numbers on tables. Asset lists reviewed. Patricia had submitted our full position in advance, and Holt had submitted his client's counterposition. And the early portion of the meeting was the two attorneys doing the careful work of identifying where the positions overlapped and where they did not. Marcus sat with his legal pad and wrote things occasionally. The younger associate typed. I sat with my hands folded on the table in front of me and listened to every word. Then Gerald Holt said they would like to propose a settlement figure. The number he named was $240,000, not the $380,000 the infidelity clause entitled me to, not anything close to a fair accounting of what I had contributed to Marcus's business infrastructure over the course of our marriage. A number that assumed I would be grateful for it, that assumed I had come to this table without options, that assumed the woman sitting across from them had spent the last 6 weeks crying instead of planning. Marcus looked at me when Holt finished speaking, and then he smiled. Not a full smile. The right side only one. The one that meant he had already decided something. "Look," he said, and his voice had the particular warmth of a man performing reasonableness. "I know this isn't what either of us wanted, but I think this is fair, Naomi. I think you know it's fair. You're going to be fine. You've always landed on your feet." He paused. He let the next sentence arrive with the casualness of something he'd been saving. "You're going to walk away with nothing to complain about." The room was quiet. Patricia glanced at me once briefly, the way a surgeon glances at a second pair of hands in the room, confirming readiness. I reached into the folder in front of me. I took out 11 pages held together by a single binder clip, and I slid them across the mahogany table. The document landed in front of Marcus with the soft sound of paper on polished wood. He looked down at it. His expression didn't change immediately. There was a half-second of blankness, the face of a man who has not yet processed what he is looking at. Then his eyes moved across the top of the first page, and something shifted in his jaw. Not much, just enough. Gerald Holt reached over and took the document. He began reading. The room was very quiet. The air conditioning ran. Somewhere below on Peachtree Street, 14 floors down, a car horn sounded once and then stopped. I watched Gerald Holt read. He was a man who had practiced law for a long time and had learned to keep his face still. And he kept it still now, but there were things you could not entirely control: the slight pause before he turned to the second page, the almost imperceptible moment when his eyes went back to reread a section he had just passed, the way his hand shifted to hold the document slightly differently with more care, as though the weight of it had changed. He reached the tabbed section Patricia had labeled Exhibit C. He stopped reading. He looked at Patricia. Patricia looked back at him with the patient expression of someone who has already read the end of the story. "Excuse me," Gerald Holt said. He said it to no one in particular. He stood, gathered the document, and said to his associate, "Come with me a moment." She closed her laptop and followed him out of the room. The door closed behind them with a soft, definitive click. Marcus sat at the table. He was looking at me. I looked back at him the way I had looked at balance sheets for 15 years, without flinching, without emotion, with the clear-eyed attention of someone who has already reconciled the numbers and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. "What is that?" he said. His voice was different. The warmth was gone. The performance of reasonableness had collapsed in the time it took Gerald Holt to read 4 pages. "You signed it in April 2015, I said. "In this building, actually. Different floor." He looked at the door Holt had walked through, then back at me. "Naomi, the infidelity clause is on page 7, I said. "Section 9C. I've read it many times. I think you'll find it's very clear." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his yellow legal pad as though it might offer him something. It did not. He looked at the door again. 22 minutes would pass before Gerald Holt came back on through it. And in those 22 minutes, Marcus Webb sat at a mahogany table on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta and said almost nothing at all. I sat across from him and said nothing either. I did not need to. The document was doing all the talking. Gerald Holt came back through the door at 11:41. He had been gone 22 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I'd been watching the clock on the wall behind Marcus's left shoulder, the same kind of plain analog clock with a white face that Patricia had in her office, the kind that makes no sound. And I had watched every one of those minutes pass with the same steady attention I had brought to everything else in the last 6 weeks. Holt sat down. His associate sat beside him. She did not reopen her laptop. Holt set the document on the table in front of him and folded his hands over it with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his next words very precisely. He looked at Patricia. "We'd like to request a brief continuance," he said. 2 weeks to allow our client to review the materials and consult with us more thoroughly." Patricia said, 1 week. Holt looked at his associate. She said nothing. He looked back at Patricia. 10 days. 7, Patricia said. "And I'll need written confirmation of the continuance request by close of business today." Holt said that was acceptable. He gathered his documents. He said something brief and professional to Patricia about scheduling. He did not look at me. His associate packed her laptop bag with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to be out of the room as quickly as possible without appearing to rush. Marcus stood when Holt stood. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up his legal pad, which had very little written on it. He looked at me one more time across the table, not the assessing glance from when he'd walked in, and not the half-smile, not anything I had a name for. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of something he had not believed existed until this morning, looking down. He didn't say anything. He walked out. The door closed. Patricia and I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after they left. She poured herself the last of the coffee from the carafe on the credenza. She sat back down. She looked at her notebook. 7 days, she said. Yes, I said. He'll settle. I know. She clicked her pen open. How are you feeling? I thought about the question seriously, the way she had always seemed to want me to when she asked it, which was not often. Like I've been holding my breath for 6 weeks, I said. And I just exhaled. She nodded. That's about right. She walked me out to the elevator at noon. We shook hands in the lobby. Patricia was not a hugger, which I respected, and I walked out onto Peachtree Street into the full midday light of Atlanta in May, which is bright and warm and carries the particular quality of a city that is always in some register under construction. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then I called my mother. She answered on the first ring the way she always did, and I said, "Mama, it's done." And she made a sound I had not heard from her in months, a small, relieved sound, the sound of a woman who had been holding something on her daughter's behalf without being asked. And then she said, "Come for dinner. Your father wants to see you." I said I'd be there by 6. The settlement arrived in 7 days, as Patricia had predicted. Marcus agreed to the full $380,000, stipulated by the infidelity clause, payable in 2 tranches, $200,000 within 30 days of the signed agreement, and $180,000 within 90 days. He also agreed to relinquish any claim to the $1,574,147 in independently held assets protected under the prenuptial agreement, which he had been legally unable to contest from the beginning, but which his attorney had nonetheless spent 3 months building a strategy around claiming. Additionally, and this was the part that Patricia told me with the closest thing to satisfaction I had ever heard in her voice, Marcus was required to cover our legal fees, a figure that, given the complexity of the discovery process and the documentation work, came to $47,000. It was not a number that would change his life, but it was a number that meant he had paid for the privilege of underestimating me. The financial collapse came in pieces the way these things always do, not a single explosion, but a series of smaller failures that built on each other until the structure couldn't hold. The first piece was the business audit. In the course of our discovery process, Patricia's team had reviewed the financial records I had access to as a co-signer on Marcus's original business line of credit. What they found, and what they shared with the appropriate parties as required by law, was a pattern of expense misclassification that had been present in Marcus Webb Construction's books for at least 3 years. Restaurant charges submitted as client entertainment. Hotel stays filed as site visits. The same Amber, whose last name I now knew was Reeves, had accompanied Marcus on 4 trips submitted to his business insurance as professional travel. The audit was not something I initiated in a retributive sense. It was a consequence of documentation that already existed, reviewed by people whose job it was to review it. I mention this distinction because I'm precise about these things. Marcus's 2 largest commercial clients were notified of the audit in the same week the settlement was signed. Both requested contract reviews. One suspended its agreement pending resolution. The other terminated outright, a contract worth $340,000 annually that had been the backbone of his operational revenue since 2020. The second piece was Amber. She learned about the settlement on a Thursday. I don't know exactly how, whether Marcus told her or whether she found out through the particular information network that exists in Atlanta's professional class, where everyone knows someone who knows someone. And by Friday evening, she had removed every trace of Marcus from her social media presence. By Saturday morning, she had blocked him on every platform he had ever mentioned to his friends. By Sunday, his calls to her were going directly to voicemail. A mutual acquaintance told me this not as gossip, but as an observation prefaced with the words, "I thought you should know," in the tone people use when they think information will be satisfying. It was a little. Not because I wished Amber harm, she had made choices, as had Marcus, and the accounting for those choices was already well underway, but because there is something clarifying about watching a man discover that the thing he burned his life down for was not in the end as permanent as he had believed. The Escalade went up for sale on a Saturday in June. I saw it listed online because Marcus had posted it in a community marketplace group. We were both still members of an oversight. Or perhaps he no longer thought about what I might and might not see. Black, fully loaded 2023. The asking price was $4,000 below market value, which told me he needed the cash more than he needed the negotiation. I looked at the listing for a moment. Then I closed the tab. I did not need to watch that part. I had already watched the part that mattered. The third piece was the one that settled into me most quietly in a different register than the financial and professional consequences in the register where the real reckoning happens. Marcus's mother called him the week the audit results came back. Cheryl called me afterward. She did this periodically now, brief calls, careful ones, the calls of a woman maintaining a relationship she valued independent of the marriage that had connected us. And she told me without editorial that she had spoken to him. She said he was struggling. She said he was in a different apartment now, a rental in Decatur, and that he was eating takeout most nights and working reduced hours while the business tried to stabilize. She said he had asked about me. Not to get back together, not to relitigate anything, just asked, "Is she okay?" I sat with that for a while after I got off the phone with Cheryl. The question of a man who had caused damage, asking whether the person he damaged was all right, it is not a simple thing to hold. It contains both accountability and inadequacy in the same breath. It is the question of someone who has begun to understand what they did, but does not yet know what to do with that understanding. I hoped in the most uncomplicated part of myself that he would figure it out. Not for me. I was past the point where his figuring things out had any bearing on my life. I hoped it for him and for Cheryl, and for the 3 employees who still worked for Marcus Webb Construction and were waiting to find out if there would still be a company to work for in the fall. The blue notebook I had started in March was full by June. 100 pages, college-ruled, filled from the first line of the first page to the last line of the last, in blue ink in my handwriting, tight and slanted and precise, the handwriting of someone who learned early that space on the page was not unlimited and should be used accordingly. I bought a second one. I didn't start it the same night. I let a few days pass first. Then I sat down at my desk, in the quiet of an apartment that was now entirely mine. I had moved out in May into a place in Inman Park, with high ceilings and a kitchen window that caught the afternoon light. A place I had chosen because it felt like a beginning, rather than a concession, and I opened the new notebook to the first page. I uncapped the blue pen. I wrote the date, and underneath it for the first time, I wrote something that wasn't a record or a note or a piece of documentation. I wrote a question: what do you want to build next? The call I had not expected came on a Thursday morning in July at 8:52, while I was standing in my kitchen in Inman Park eating yogurt over the sink because I had not yet bought a proper set of bar stools for the island. and I developed the habit of eating breakfast standing up and looking out the window at the street below, which I found I liked more than I expected to. The number was one I recognized, but had not seen on my screen in years. Derek Osei. Marcus's business partner from 2018 to 2021, before the partnership dissolved over a contract dispute that Marcus had described to me at the time as Derek being unreasonable. I had met Derek perhaps 8 times over the course of their partnership. A quiet, precise man. An engineer by training who had moved into commercial development, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke in meetings, and whose questions, when he asked them, were always the ones that mattered. I answered. "Naomi," he said, "I hope this isn't a bad time." I said it wasn't. He was careful with his words, in the way careful people are when they are about to say something that requires calibration. He said he had heard about the divorce professionally, he specified not through gossip, through the audit disclosure process, which had required notification of former business associates. He said he was not calling about Marcus. He said he was calling because he had been watching my career. For some time he said this, without any of the awkwardness it might have carried from a different person as simple fact, and because he was in the process of restructuring his development firm and was looking for a financial partner with specific expertise. "What kind of expertise?" I said. "Asset protection," he said. "Prenuptial and post-nuptial financial architecture. Divorce-adjacent financial planning for high-net-worth individuals." A pause. "It's a gap in the market, Naomi. And from what I understand, you have a particular insight into the territory." I set down my yogurt. I looked out the window at the street below, at the ordinary Thursday morning, moving past a woman, pushing a stroller. A man in running clothes stopping to check his watch, a delivery truck idling at the corner. "Tell me more," I said. That conversation lasted 40 minutes and produced a meeting the following week and a proposal the week after that. And I'm getting ahead of myself because the point is not where it led, but what it told me about something I had been turning over since June, that the knowledge I had accumulated not just professionally but personally in parking garages and lawyers' offices and conference rooms and at kitchen tables at midnight with a blue pen was not incidental. It was not the unfortunate byproduct of a marriage that ended badly. It was expertise. Hard-won, precisely documented, personally tested expertise. And expertise, in my experience, is never wasted. The women started calling in August. Not strangers, people I knew, or people who knew people I knew, connected through the particular network of Atlanta's professional Black community where information moves through trust rather than broadcast. A colleague from my firm whose marriage was fraying and who had a prenuptial agreement she hadn't read since she signed it. A friend of a friend who was 3 months into a divorce and had just discovered that her husband had been restructuring his business assets in ways that were technically legal and practically devastating. A woman from my Spelman alumni group who was getting married in the spring and wanted to understand what she was signing before she signed it. I took the calls. All of them. In the evenings, from my kitchen in Inman Park, with the window open and the summer sounds of the city coming in. I did not charge for them. They were not billable hours. They were conversations, but I was precise and thorough. And I gave each woman the same quality of attention I would have given a paying client, because the information I had was not theoretical. I had lived it. I knew where the gaps were because I had stood in them. After the 5th call, my colleague Renee, the one who hosted the holiday dinner where I had counted Marcus's phone checks, said to me, "Naomi, you need to charge for this. What you're giving these women is worth money." I said I knew. She said, "So what are you waiting for?" I did not have a good answer to that. I had been telling myself, I was still in the recovery phase, that I needed more time before I made major professional decisions, that I should let the dust settle before I built something new in it. But the truth, which I was becoming more honest with myself about, was that the dust had already settled. I had settled it myself deliberately over the course of 6 months of precise and patient work. I was not recovering. I had recovered. What I was doing now was hesitating at the door of the next thing, because starting something new requires a different kind of courage than the one I'd been exercising. The courage of excavation, of digging into a crisis and documenting what you find that I had. I had built it over years, without knowing I was building it. The courage of construction, of standing in front of something that does not yet exist, and deciding to make it exist. That was the one I was still working on. Renee helped in her direct and unceremonious way by sending me a text 2 days after our conversation that said only, "You already know how to do this. Stop thinking and file the paperwork." I laughed out loud in my empty apartment. Then I called Patricia, not for legal advice, for a referral. Patricia knew every attorney, notary, and business formation specialist in Atlanta, and she gave me 3 names in the time it took her to flip to the right page in her notebook. I called all 3. I had meetings with 2. By the end of September, I had filed the paperwork for a limited liability company. The name took me longer than the paperwork. I went through 17 options over the course of 3 weeks. Names that were too corporate, too soft, too generic, too on the nose. I made lists in the blue notebook. I crossed things out. I came back to the same few words in different combinations. And then one evening, I was sitting at the kitchen island. On the bar stool, I had finally bought a single one. Because I was living alone, and I was not going to buy furniture for a life I did not yet have. And I was not thinking about the name at all. I was looking at the window and thinking about something Cheryl had said to me months ago, the sentence she had said without meaning it as advice. "You were always the one holding things together, weren't you?" I opened my notebook. I wrote down 2 words: Cornerstone Advisory. I looked at it for a moment. It was right in the way that right things are right, not flashy, not performing, simply accurate. Solid, load-bearing. The kind of name that described a function rather than a feeling, which was appropriate for the kind of work I intended to do. I circled it in blue ink. The reaction from my professional network was immediate and almost overwhelming in a way I had not anticipated. The first announcement, a single post on LinkedIn. Measured and precise, describing the firm's focus on financial planning and asset protection for women navigating major life transitions, received 247 responses in the first 48 hours. I noticed the number, 247, the same as the photographs. I do not believe in signs as a category of phenomenon, but I believe in the weight of coincidence, in the way certain numbers become attached to certain chapters of your life and follow you through them. 247 had been the number of the crisis. Now it was the number of the response to what I had built from it. I sat with that for a while. Patricia sent me a text when she saw the post. It said, "Good name. No punctuation as always." I wrote back, "Thank you for everything." She responded, "That's what I'm paid for." Which was true, and also not entirely the truth, and we both knew it. My father called on a Sunday, his customary call time unchanged since I was in college, and he said he had seen the announcement. He said the name was strong. He said it communicated structural integrity, which, coming from a civil engineer who had spent 31 years thinking about load distribution, was the highest praise he knew how to offer. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Your mother wants to know if you're eating properly." I said I was. He said, "Good." And then before he hung up, "Naomi, you did good work this year." He did not specify what kind of work. He did not need to. We both knew he was not talking about the company. I said, "I had a good teacher." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one which was from Winston Webb, approximately equivalent to tears of pride. We said goodbye. I put the phone down on the kitchen island, next to the blue notebook, next to the uncapped pen, next to the remains of a dinner I had made for myself, actually made with groceries I had bought on a Sunday morning from the Whole Foods on Ponce de Leon Avenue. Not because I was performing domesticity, but because cooking had become, in recent months, one of the ways I reminded myself that I was building something, even something as ordinary as a meal from raw materials, into a thing that sustained. Outside the window, Atlanta was settling into a Thursday evening in October. The particular light of an Atlanta autumn that is warmer and longer than it should be, that lingers past its welcome in the best possible way, that makes the city look for a few weeks every year like a place that is not in any hurry to become what it is still becoming. I looked at it for a while. Then I turned back to the notebook. There was still a lot of the page left. The office I rented was on the 9th floor of a building on Auburn Avenue, not Buckhead, not Midtown. Auburn Avenue. Sweet Auburn, the corridor that had been the economic and cultural center of Black Atlanta for a century, the street where Ebenezer Baptist Church still stood, where Herndon's insurance empire had been built, where the architecture carried the memory of people who had constructed something durable in conditions that were not designed to support construction. I chose it deliberately the way I had chosen the flat shoes and the blue pen and the name Cornerstone Advisory, because the place you build from matters, and I wanted to build from ground that already knew what it meant to hold something up. The office itself was modest. 400 square feet, a window that faced east. A desk I had ordered from a small furniture maker in Decatur who worked in Walnut and took 6 weeks to deliver and was worth every day of the wait. A single chair on the client side of the desk. A bookshelf that I filled slowly over the first 2 months, with texts on financial law and asset protection and divorce economics, and 2 books on behavioral finance that I had been meaning to read for 3 years and had never found the time for when I was busy managing someone else's trajectory. On the corner of the desk next to my laptop, I kept the blue pen. Not the original that one had run dry in August mid-sentence in the second notebook, but one identical to it. Same brand, same ink color, because by then the pen had become something I did not want to give up. Not a talisman, nothing that mystical. Just a reminder that the work began with a specific decision to sit down and document, and that every version of the work since then had been an extension of that same decision. Cornerstone Advisory opened for client intake on the first Monday of November. I had 4 clients scheduled that first week. By the end of the month, I had 11. By February, I had a wait list. The women who came to me were not all in crisis. Some of them were women in the middle of divorces, women who had just discovered something they hadn't been meant to discover. Women sitting across from me with the particular expression of someone who has received information that has rearranged the entire architecture of their present life. I recognized that expression. I had worn it myself in a parking garage in March, looking at a screen counting. For those women, I offered what Patricia had offered me: precision patience and the complete absence of judgment about how they had arrived at this point. It is not useful to ask how a woman ended up unprotected. It is useful to assess the current position accurately and build forward from it. But other women came who were not in crisis at all. Young women getting married who had heard through the particular grapevine of Atlanta's professional community that there was someone on Auburn Avenue who would sit with you and read your prenuptial agreement and ask the questions your attorney might not think to ask, because your attorney did not have the specific experience of being on the other side of one. Women in long marriages who had never looked closely at their financial position and wanted to, not because anything was wrong, but because knowing what you have is different from assuming it. Women who had been through their own versions of what I had been through and wanted to help other women avoid it, and who came to me asking how they might get involved. That last category was the one I hadn't anticipated. Her name was Beverly. She found me through the LinkedIn post. She was the 211th response, which I know because I had read every one. And she came to my office on a Tuesday morning in December in a winter coat the color of deep plum, and sat across the walnut desk and told me she had been through a divorce in 2019 that had cost her things she was still calculating. She was 51 years old and had spent the intervening years building a legal aid nonprofit focused on family law for women without resources, and she wanted to talk about a partnership. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of the conversation, we had the outline of something that did not yet have a name, but had a shape, a program, that would pair Cornerstone Advisory's financial planning services with Beverly's legal aid network, providing both financial and legal counsel to women navigating divorce who could not otherwise afford either. Not pro bono exactly. Beverly was specific about the economics of sustainability, which I respected, but a sliding scale structure that made the service accessible without making it a charity, because Beverly had strong feelings about dignity in professional services, and so did I. I thought sitting across from her in my office on the 9th floor of a building on Auburn Avenue on a December Tuesday about the woman in the Kroger parking lot in 2011, 23 years old, looking at a receipt calculating which items to put back. About what it would have meant to have someone in her corner then who understood not just the emotional weight of financial precarity, but the mechanics of it. Who could have told her what to look for in a document before she signed it? Who had been where she was and come out the other side with something built? I told Beverly I was in. She said good. She said she had been watching the Auburn Avenue community for something like this for 2 years. She clicked her pen. She was a pen clicker too, I noticed, which I took as a good sign, and said, "So, where do we start?" I opened my notebook, I uncapped the blue pen, and I started at the beginning, which is where all durable things begin. There is a version of this story I could tell you that is about Marcus, about what he did, about what it cost him, about the specific arithmetic of consequence that followed him through the fall and into the winter. And that version would be true as far as it goes. But it is not the version that stayed with me. The version that stayed with me is about a woman sitting in a car in a parking garage, very still, deciding not to react yet. Deciding to wait until she had what she needed. Deciding that the most powerful thing she could do in that moment was nothing, and then deciding to do everything. What I learned in the year from March to March is not something I could have been told in advance. You cannot be warned into this kind of knowing. You have to go through the specific sequence of it, the smell you can't name. The phone face down on the counter, the 41 minutes of stillness, the blue pen the document slid across the mahogany table, the silence that followed, and come out the other side with the thing that only comes from having actually survived the thing. But here is what I can tell you from the other side of it. What you have built quietly over years without asking for recognition, without making it visible, without needing anyone to see the work that is yours. It does not disappear because someone decided you were not worth the attention it deserved. It does not diminish because someone laughed and said you would walk away with nothing. It sits there documented and protected, waiting for the moment when you decide to slide it across the table. And when you do, when you have done the work, and you have the document, and you are wearing the flat shoes, and you're ready, you don't have to say anything at all. The silence does it for you. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to sit with something for a moment. Naomi didn't win because she got lucky. She didn't win because she was smarter than everyone else in the room. She won because she had spent years, quietly, without announcement, without needing a witness, building something that could not be taken from her. A financial foundation. A document she understood before she signed it. A discipline of knowing exactly what she had always. Most of us are never taught to do that. We are taught to trust. We are taught to merge. We are taught that paying close attention to your own financial position is somehow unromantic, suspicious, a signal that you are not fully committed. We are taught to believe that love and protection are opposites, when the truth is that real love does not ask you to be unprotected. So here's what I want you to take from Naomi's story. Know what you have. All of it. Not roughly. Precisely. Know what your name is on what your name is, not on what is protected and what is not. Know what you signed. Read it again if you have to. Ask the question your attorney didn't think to ask. And if you are already in the middle of it, if you are sitting in your own parking garage in your own moment of stillness, counting your own version of 247, know this: The work you do right now in the quiet before the confrontation is the most important work you will ever do. Not the loudest, the most important. You're not behind. You're not too late. You're exactly where Naomi was in March, which is the beginning of the part where she won. Do the work. Keep the pen. Hold the document. And when the moment comes, you'll know it. Slide it across the table. If this story moved you, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me what time is it where you are right now. And what are you holding on to that someone else has underestimated? And if you believe another woman needs to hear this today, share it with her. Some stories are meant to travel. We'll be back with another one soon.